Hello and welcome everybody to this edition of Triggered and True with myself, Brian Friese, and the famous Laura Duncan.
Hello.
Hi, Laura.
Hi.
So today is a continuation of Laura's famous quotes. So there's so many of them, we couldn't get them all in one podcast. So we're continuing on today. So are you excited for that?
I am. The quotes are kind of nice because they're those one-liners that keep us remembering some really important truths to the compassion methods. That's why I like to emphasize the quotes, because then we end up remembering them and being able to more effectively apply them.
And I also want to thank our listeners because we've been getting a few questions. And we'll be having a podcast soon dedicated to answering those questions. Maybe that'll be our next podcast. So
yeah, that'll be exciting.
Be looking for that. And some of these questions, it might take us a little while to get back to you, but if it's a good question, which they say there's no such thing as bad questions, but if it's a good question that's relevant to lots of readers and listeners, we will be sure to get it included. The first quote we're going to address is one that you say often. You share how your adult self is like a website and your child self is your coding. Change the coding and you change the website. So we're going to get into a little bit of computer programming. So fire away.
Yeah. So a lot of times when we are listening to podcasts like this or becoming emotionally aware, emotionally intelligent, we are trying to change our adult behaviors and habits and the areas that we feel like we need to change or grow in. But what happens is you do a lot of work on your adult self, but because your child self, which, like you said, is our coding, is telling a different story, no matter how much we try to change our adult self, we're still going to go back to the original programming coding. So if you think about, a real website, if you went in there and tried to change it, you couldn't. And so when we go and try to change our brain without going back to where we first started to have lack or pain, we're still going to repeat the same process over and over again, as well as any changes that we make to our adult self have to be maintained manually. And that's a huge component of the compassion method, that when we are able to not necessarily change our coding, but when we're able to infuse, the reason why I say not changing our coding, because we can't change our life story. Whatever happened to you in your early childhood development is part of your story, part of who you are today. But if we infuse your early childhood development with the 10 gifts, with love, with compassion, with nurture, and you feel full in your childhood, you're going to feel full as an adult. And those changes will become automatic versus manual. And that's really my all-time favorite thing about the compassion method, that when those needs are met in early childhood development, our pain is comforted, we automatically react and respond differently in our lives.
And a lot of what you're saying is why going to the local bookstore and buying a bunch of self-help books, which is kind of like going and buying home improvement books.
Yep.
It is very frustrating for people because they're trying to change the website.
Exactly. And one of the things on a neurological level that can actually make that detrimental to our growth and getting healed is the fact that when you, let's just say that you read a book about dieting or eating healthy, your brain is responding and hearing that information. So it gives it the feeling of it's done it. It's done whatever changes need to happen. But you actually didn't do whatever that book is telling you to do on home improvement or dieting or whatever you'd like to say, but your brain thinks it has because it learned all the knowledge of it, but didn't actually get what it needed to do it. So without that direct application, we have a lot of concepts and ideas of what it means to be healthy and whole, but we're not actually automatically living from that place.
So how would a person on a very practical level, and we've shared lots of things, but break that down like real practical, how do you go back and just tie to some of the stuff we've already talked about? So how do you tie back to the coding? What's tying back to that childhood coding?
If you're coding, let's say, for example, that your coding says that, actually, let's use, if you don't mind, let's use something that before we started this podcast, you had been sharing that you felt like you had to do everything on your own.
Yeah, you do not have permission to do that. No.
Say, never mind, scratch that.
No,
We'll delete that from the
no.
podcast. Too
Absolutely.
personal.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
But Brian was just sharing about how, he felt like because of his early childhood development, his coding said, you have to do everything on your own. And one of the things I didn't say when you were sharing it is when you said that, even I wasn't even trying to connect it to your child self, but even a little bit of like your tone and how you said it reminded me of, because if we've worked together before, I know what your child self is like. It reminded me of you being little. And I could picture when you were saying it, even though you're obviously a mature adult at this time, I could picture you being little. And that's what you thought your reality was because of your circumstances, because of real or perceived what you thought you had to do at a very young age. Let's say if you had to walk to the bus by yourself or walk home by yourself or be by yourself and do your own thing, and your coding says, I have to do everything on my own, except for lunch. I have to do everything on my own. And so now transfer it to now being the age that you are present day, that coding, unless it's been taken care of and comforted, and you've had a mommy and a daddy that could help you not have to do it all on your own, you're still going to believe you have to do it on your own because your coding is sending you the signal you have to do it all on your own. So until we're able to infuse the coding that says you are not alone, mommies and daddies want to walk you to the bus. They want to be with you.
Well, and we talked about this a little bit last time when we talked about in early childhood development, we need connection, like we need food and water. So like in my case, I was not physically alone. Well, I was sometimes, but it wasn't so much a physical aloneness as an emotional aloneness. For a lot of me, this feeling alone is I'm very alone emotionally. So yeah, so you have to pull up that memory. So in my case, I can pull up those memories because I've done this for a while. I'm able to go to those memories, but a lot of people aren't. Like that pain is so strong. They don't want to go there because the pain's too intense. They don't know how to go there. And a lot of times it's very blank. So I've had experience like when I hit those moments of almost living that moment vicariously through other people. Like when I see other people relating to their children, or even how I relate to my own children, or I can see myself in my children. So what are some other strategies to help people bridge that gap?
That's great. Indirectly, by being able to watch it play out. Indirectly, sometimes we can receive in that way. Being able, like we talked about in the 10 gifts, to be able to find other people and other situations that you've felt that with. Sometimes if we're too afraid to face our pain, which is very normal and very natural for us not to want to face our pain. But sometimes if we can invite more love in, it'll make us feel safer to feel our pain. So usually when people first go back to their pain, there's going to be a natural resistance to it until we can get some love in there. And then once love can get in there, then there's an openness to be able to receive the love that will heal the lack. So kind of similar to like, I've used this example before in a little bit different context, but like with a foster child, like you wouldn't be able to directly go to their trauma and pain when they first came into your home because they don't know you, they don't trust you. It would feel scary. It would feel they would be pushing your love away. They would be pushing the help that was coming to them away. But as you build rapport, trust, connection with them, they'd feel safer and safer to address their pain. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we have to bring love in before we can face our pain.
I think some people might, I guess this wasn't for me, but I think some people would hear the word changing your coding and get kind of weirded out by that a little bit potentially. And we're not going back and changing any memories. We're not going back and try to pretend something that happened that didn't happen. But what we are doing is we're going back to those painful memories and we're infusing them with love. We're bringing comfort and love to those painful places. We didn't know how to see what was available, or in some cases, comfort and love wasn't available. And now we're going to come back and bring it. And that's the rewiring, that's the renewing of our mind that God has enabled us to be able to do.
Exactly. And so just like you said, we can't actually change what's happened to you. A lot of times when people do recognize our early childhood development affects is our coding and affects our adult self, they'll want to go back and they'll want to change it. So we go back to a memory where they felt pain. They just want to take the child away from the pain, or they want to change the story. But then we'd be creating a fantasy that wouldn't be based on reality, that wouldn't satisfy the very real pain we experience and the very real memory and the real experience we had. So we have to actually be in the memory, be in the pain, and like you're saying, infuse it with love. And when that memory is infused with love, that pain doesn't feel so big anymore.
I think this ties in real good to the next quote that we were going to talk about. The bigger the trigger, the younger you are.
It's a really great quote. Another thing I would say about why these quotes are so important, it's not just saying like, these are quotes are really good quotes, you should know them. It's also that when you're in a triggered state, your brain, your adult brain that knows how to think very profound thoughts and, in-depth thoughts isn't working anymore. So all the knowledge we learn as adults is we don't have access to in a triggered moment. So that's also why I like quotes and one-liners, because what happens is even in a triggered state, I can remember bigger the trigger, the younger I am. And so I know in that triggered state, because it's so strong, I'm little right now. I'm little right now. Bigger the trigger, the younger I am. Even if I don't know why it's happening, even if I haven't been able to connect to my emotions around it, I know I'm little. And just that one redirection helps.
What I found is just from that, what you just said, when I'm in that triggered place in the little, it is so much easier to have compassion on a little person.
Yep.
Than an adult.
That's acting like a little person.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. It's true though. And that also helps us recognize it's not who we are. It's not our true self. And we're not an adult in that moment, which helps us, like you said just now, helps us give more compassion, but also helps us understand why we're acting the way we're acting and helps us step away from there's something wrong with me, step away from the need to fix, because there's nothing wrong with us and there's nothing that needs to be fixed. Because we're so triggered by whatever event or person, we're little, and we're actually, if we're in that amygdala, and if we're in our child brain, there's actually nothing wrong with us. We're acting just right. We are 3 years old. Our brain is in the part of our brain is activated. The part of our brain that makes us, that our little self, 3-year-old self is activated. We are 3 years old. So it can help us recognize there's nothing wrong. We're just in a different part of our brain that's causing us to react like a child. So bigger the trigger, the younger you are, also helps you differentiate how much you're in your child brain and how much you're in your adult brain. Because sometimes if I'm only at like a 5 trigger or a 6 trigger, that means if you do it in percentages, if I feel like I'm at a 5 in a trigger, I'm 50% in my child brain and 50% in my adult brain. But if I'm at a 10 in a trigger, I'm 100% in my child brain. And so that helps us recognize I'm not acting like myself right now. Pain has been pressed on that's causing me to react and go back to being a child again.
You recognize why you're not yourself right now, but it also helps you obviously recognize why other people aren't themselves right now.
It made so much sense after I learned this, because I remember thinking even at like a young age, just because I've been wanting to help people from a very young age. I remember thinking as a child, like maybe like 10 years old, looking at adults and being like, they're acting like children right now, but like not understanding it. And then being like, why are they acting like that? What's wrong with them? Because it was so weird to see your very adult mom and dad in a triggered state acting like a 5-year-old. So there's something really off there, but you don't know why it's happening. You don't know what exactly is happening. So years later, when I learned how our brain functions, I learned what was happening. I had so many aha moments for myself, of course, but I also had aha moments of, oh, that's what was happening. They were kids in that moment. That's what it felt like. They were kids. It's because their brains were functioning as children in that moment. And then the same for being a parent, being able to see that in our own kids.
I remember one of the first times I shared this with somebody, and he's like, I was at a county board meeting the night before. And he's like, now I understand why everyone was acting the way that they were.
No, it's true though, because especially and we've seen it during this last couple of years with so many things happening in our country and our world. I mean, there's so many people that I've always thought of as very mature, wise adults that are now acting very immature, very unwise, like children. And so it really helps us recognize that, this people are not in their adult brain in those moments. And I love that because you see that come out in those types of settings.
Well, and I think this is a good point. I want to give a little prelude to a podcast we're going to do in the future on social media and artificial intelligence and what's kind of how that's impacting society. But really what those things are designed to do, they are designed to trigger you. So some of what we see in society is that we have a bigger trigger stimulus because the AI and the algorithms know that the more triggered you are, the longer you're going to stay on the site.
Yep, exactly.
Because your adult self would be like, I've been on TikTok for 2.5 hours. Probably should go do something else.
Exactly. But our child self gets sucked in because we're getting something from it that is affecting our child brain in that moment. And also, like, if you think, sometimes I look at being triggered as like being drunk or, being, in a place where like you're not making good decisions. And so if you think about it, even like in selling things to people, if you can trigger people, they're going to make impulse decisions. They're going to make impulse buys. And so a lot of times, not all, but some marketing is specifically designed to trigger you to cause you to react to their benefit.
That's interesting. I've been in sales my whole professional career, and I have always been so intentional about making sure people, and I never knew this before, but it's really obvious to me now that I go out of my way to make sure people aren't making a triggered purchase because I want them to make this purchase. Because one of my big things is always, I want to underpromise and overdeliver. So I do not want them, because if they make this on a trigger because they're scared, what's going to happen is that you're not going to be able to deliver on that. And then they're going to be unhappy. And part of it, part of this, honestly, it's my insecurities actually playing a little bit to my favor and a little bit that way, because I don't want them coming back and being upset with me because that was hitting my value button.
Totally.
I'm like, then if they're mad at me, I'm not valuable. So I'm going to underpromise, overdeliver, and I'm going to feature and benefit them to death until they're just like, oh, of course I have to do this. It's just so good, But anyway, it's just, yeah.
No, but that's also wise, because if they're making impulse decisions, like you said, not only are they going to be mad, but you're not going to actually be able to have a relationship with them. That's why you can see that most sales that doesn't, because it sounds like, that one big part of your business is relationship with your customers,
We're really more of a service oriented business than a sales business. There's a sales component, but then we sell them and then we service them ongoing for hopefully the rest of their careers. So
exactly. So you're not in it for the short term. So if you did it only on a trigger and they made an impulse decision, you wouldn't be able to have a long-term relationship.
Like if I was selling encyclopedias and it's going to be a one-time deal, I'm never going to see you again.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. So it would still be hard for me. But the part that obviously we're addressing through the compassion method through my time of working with you is the value button, because guess what? People are going to be not happy.
Yeah.
It's impossible.
Going to happen. Not if, when, because they're always going to be someone is always going to be unhappy.
Just like when we get to the last quote that we're going to hit today, we're going to reveal there's always going to be unhappy people.
That's true.
Even if you were the definition of customer service, you are not going to make them all happy. So, All right, next quote. Every capital letter emotion is a child emotion.
Yeah. So because we are emotional beings, you're going to feel things. And so our goal with the compassion method isn't to be emotionless. We want to feel emotion. It's healthy to feel emotion. If you're numb and suppressed and shut down and don't feel anything, that's not the goal of the compassion method.
Well, then you're just triggered.
Exactly. Yeah. You're triggered and you're in a flight because you're just all suppressed and shut down. And so sometimes people get confused because they're like, well, this person wronged me and I felt this really big emotion. Isn't that normal? Isn't that okay? Shouldn't I feel that angry or that big of emotion? But if we're in our sophisticated brain, if we're in our adult brain, we're going to feel lowercase-letter emotions. And what I mean by that is I'm going to feel angry. That's part of being a human. I'm going to feel disappointed. I'm going to feel discouraged. I'm going to feel lonely. I'm going to feel sad. But an adult, because they know how to logic and reason, they know they have options and resources, that their brain is extraordinary to figure out a different outcome than what's being presented, will feel angry, but will feel lowercase a angry because they know it's not the end of the world. It's not life or death. It's not all or nothing. But when we're in our triggered brain, our amygdala, our child brain, we no longer have access to that sophisticated brain. So when we feel angry as a child, we don't have the same sophisticated intelligence to be able to recognize that it's not the end of the world, that I'm going to be okay. So an adult brain, a child brain, when they feel it, it feels life or death. So they feel capital A angry. They feel capital L lonely. So it's just this quote is a very good, quick indicator to be able to say, okay, just felt rush of emotion. Did this feel like a capital letter emotion, or did this feel like a lowercase emotion? And if it's a lowercase emotion, it's me being a human, feeling things and experiencing things that's healthy and normal to feel. Or I'm in a triggered state and I'm in a capital letter emotion. Now these emotions aren't lining up with my adult brain.
The big litmus test for me on this is if I can see something hopeful, if I can see hope, because my adult sophisticated brain, I feel like can see a light at the end of the tunnel, know that this isn't going to be forever. This isn't like a permanent state. And I don't have to change my external world for that hope to come. And I think my child brain thinks that I have to get this person to stop doing that. I have to get this thing fixed at the office. I have to do whatever to have hope.
Or else. Exactly.
Or else.
Yeah.
And if I don't figure out the solution,
Yep.
but my adult brain's like, you don't have to figure anything out.
Yeah. And that wave of emotion is going to always be larger than the wave of emotion we'll feel when we're in our sophisticated brain. And so just being able to use that quote to be able to check in with yourself. Bigger the trigger, the younger you are. Bigger the emotion, the younger you are.
You said something, I believe we probably did it on a podcast, but it's possible that it wasn't on a podcast, where you talk about pain, and pain is so triggering oftentimes because we don't know how to comfort it. And so part of the hope that the compassion method gives me is that I know no matter what horrible thing happens in life, that I've actually learned that I can bring comfort to my inner world. I can do it. I don't have to have a friend. I don't have to. Those things are all great.
Of course. Yeah.
And we want those things.
Lowercase in need.
Yeah.
Friends and family and people loving us, but we don't capital in need those people to be able to receive comfort.
Yeah. So.
Oh, I think it's so empowering. At first, for myself and for others, I know it can feel disempowering because it makes you feel like that you have to comfort yourself to be okay. So sometimes people don't like that because they feel, especially if their childhood trigger is they had to do everything on their own, they can be resentful that now they have to comfort themselves just like they always did when they were a kid, which I know we use this quote in the last podcast we did about quotes, but self-compassion starts with you being the comforter because no one knows your heart like you know you, which is so powerful and empowering. And then it leads you into being able to connect with others.
Great stuff. Next quote. Connection to who we are versus what we do heals shame.
Yeah, shame is one of the trickiest things to heal from. Even that sentence, that we need to heal from shame is unusual for a lot of people because most people think that you just have to do something different or believe something different to be free from shame. But because shame is specifically about what we do good or what we do bad, shame says that is who you are. And so the more you try to do good and to believe better, the worse shame gets because you're feeding the knowledge of good. You're feeding being good in order to get out of shame, which keeps you in a perpetual cycle of shame. Because the more you try to get out of shame and be better and think better, the more you actually experience shame. And so the only way out of shame is through compassion and connecting to who you are, not what you do. And the only way for us not to shame others is to be able to first do that for ourselves, of course, to be able to see who we are apart from what we do. But then in turn, we're going to be able to see who the other person is apart from what they do. So that's what heals and helps us not continue to shame ourselves or others.
Yeah, the one aspect of that is societally, that's really how we categorize everybody.
Mm-hmm. Even from a young age, you ask a kid, what do you want to do when you grow up?
Yeah. And when you introduce yourself, a lot of times that comes right along with it. So how do we change the narrative, so to speak, or how can we, even as we're relating to our children or children in general, how could we do that?
Well, yeah, even starting out, and it's really difficult when you first start doing it, but starting out by trying not to label everything good or bad. You cleaned up the kitchen, that was good. You didn't do your chores, that was bad. We want to put those labels on so strongly. And it's really difficult once you start realizing how often we say something's good or bad. So starting out with being able to stop labeling things as good or bad. And then in reference to being connected to who a person is, to start to share things that encouragement, things that you see in that child based more on who they are versus what they're doing. So for example, if they, were able to organize their room really well, you would want to be able to say something more along the lines, instead of it saying, it's good you organized your room, you want it to be more, you are very creative in how you did that. You're trying to actually pull the characteristics of who they are, which I find it helpful to write down or be aware of, maybe like each of my kids' top 5 to 10 characteristics of who they are. So then I can be highlighting those things more than highlighting their behavior. So it's highlighting who they are, and their behavior is a byproduct of who they are.
And instead of like saying what you did was bad, hey, you could say, hey, you weren't acting like yourself back there.
Yep.
That exactly. Type of thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Because we know who they are. So when they are making bad choices, we know their choices are not who they are. And what I find is most bad choices that children are making are coming from their pain or lack. Yeah. So then we're going to be focusing on that. We're going to be focusing on who they are, of course, but we're also going to be focusing on their pain and lack more than making the emphasis their behavior.
All right. Well, we're heading into our last quote, which might be a very triggering one for many folks. Your quote is, you can't hurt people or help people.
The quote of you can't hurt people and you can't help people comes from the fact that as far as helping people, everyone always has to help themselves first before you can come along and be with that person and support and encourage them. So most helping implies that you're going to do for someone where we can't do for others. We can only be a support to them. So ultimately, every single person, even at young ages, 0 to 12 years old, we are teaching them and being their caregivers on how that they can be able to help themselves. That's the most powerful parenting, is teaching your kids how to help themselves. So, because at the end of the day, we can only help them for so long when they're in those developmental stages. And then even at the young age of 12 or 13, they're going to have to start learning how to help themselves, because I'm not going to be able to help them in that same way because their brain's already developed past the point of me being able to help them in that way, to do for them. So children, we do for. Adults, we don't do for. And so what that means is every single person has to help themselves. We can't help them. We can only support, encourage, and be with them.
That's a good point that you just threw out, because you're not talking about your children or your baby. You're talking about
Exactly.
other adults. You
Yep,
can't hurt or
exactly.
help other adults. Okay.
Yes. 0 to 12 years old, you are their caregiver. So you are helping a child because they can't do for themselves. But at a certain age, younger than most of us realize, they can start doing for themselves. And then we have to teach them how to help themselves. And specifically, like you're saying with adults, here we are as adults all trying to help each other. And it's not working because we're not helping ourselves.
I think you've just described why a lot of counselors, pastors, social workers burn out, right?
100%. That was one of the biggest saving graces for myself, because in the very beginning of this process, I realized I'm okay. They're okay. I can't help them. That's part of why I call myself a compassion method consultant, because I'm consulting you for you to be able to help yourself. But if I was counseling or coaching you, I'm doing for you. But if I'm consulting you, you're doing it for yourself. And it ends up becoming, the process of healing ends up becoming a personal process versus needing someone like me to do for you. We create a lot of codependency and enabling because we keep doing for other people, because ultimately we're triggered. We don't think people are okay, and we have to help them for them to be okay.
Well, there's services we can hire out. Like if you want to, get something fixed at your home, you can hire a handy person and you can hire that out.
Yep.
This taking care of your heart thing, you can't hire
You
out.
can't hire out, even with a person that is specifically like myself, helping people help themselves. They have to do it. That's why when people come and meet with me and they haven't done their homework, they think I'm going to be mad at them because they haven't done their homework. And ultimately, all I say is, if you're not willing to do it for yourself, you're not going to get the benefit of it. But I'm okay. I don't need you to do your homework for me to be okay. But if you don't do your homework, you're probably not going to be okay because you haven't done the work or taken care of yourself. And that's the sad part about it. But it's not doing your homework affects me. Not doing your homework affects you.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of people that are in the business of helping others that might be listening to this that are having some revelatory aha moments.
Yeah, no, there's definitely. And one of the really kind of, I would say, deceptive things about helpers, and I consider myself a helper, I believe that some people are more wired or created to be
well, and
a
you've
helper.
talked about that with the fawning, like how you would try to be one step ahead of everybody and anticipate their needs and try to meet them ahead of time.
Always helping, always making sure everything's okay. And what did I get for that? I got approval. I got acceptance. I was a good girl. So I had to keep helping. I had to keep doing, because that became my identity in a lot of ways. But if my identity is contingent on another person that I technically cannot help, if I have to make them okay, then I'm going to always be in a place of feeling shame or feeling hopeless or feeling like it's never going to be enough. That's why you hear a lot of helpers, that people are helping other people, say, like, no matter what I do, it just never seems to work. And then what happens is the helpers get mad at the people that they're trying to help because they're being triggered by trying to help them and they're not changing. I want people to be healthy, and I want people to go through the compassion method and find come back to their true self and the whole reason that I do what I do. But I don't need people to be okay for me to be okay. And that is such an important thing for helpers to know. Can you be okay even if the person that you're helping is not okay?
What about the hurting aspect? Because it feels like
the hurting one's a little more triggery. That's why I started with helping.
Yeah.
So it felt safer.
Because the hurting one could be like a cop out, or someone could, wow, totally. I can't hurt you.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, the hurting one. Yep. So where that I can't hurt someone originates is, and it can also be connected to our previous quote about capital H hurt versus lowercase h hurt. Where we do affect people, we do feel things. If I said something hurtful, it can still hurt you. But if I'm not in a triggered state, it's going to be a lowercase h hurt.
Which is interesting, because on the notes you sent me, you have the hurt. I just noticed this: hurt and help are capitalized.
How funny. That's really funny. So that capital H hurt is coming from a wound, That has nothing to do with whatever that person present day is doing to you. That's a hurt. That's a capital H hurt that started in your early childhood development before you probably ever even met the person that you believe is hurting you. So a lot of times I'll use the example of if I had a wound and you came over and you pressed on the wound, would you be hurting me? But if I didn't have that wound, if that wound was healed and you pressed on the same place, would you be hurting me?
You're at that point, you're just annoying me.
Exactly. So it's a big difference. That's a lowercase h hurt because I don't have a wound. So when you say something hurtful, yeah, I feel it. It affects me, but it's not a capital H hurt because there's no wound there for it to land. But most of us are walking around feeling very hurt from our external world when we're not hurt from our external world. We're hurt because of our internal world. And when we recognize that that person isn't hurting me, all they're doing is pressing on a pain that I've had for my whole life. So when I can go back to that, recognize the capital H hurt, go back and heal the hurt, the wound, and then I come back to the very same person in the very same scenario, they can't hurt me. Just the same as safety. People are always throwing out, I don't feel safe with that person. Safety is an inside job. When we feel safe in here, we can make the decisions to be around someone or not to be around someone, not because they're so unsafe, but because I'm so safe. I don't need them to be a safe person for me to be okay. So it's the same thing when we think we're hurting people or we think people are hurting us. It's something it's nothing to do with us in the sense of a capital H hurt.
Yeah, and you've described that more as a preference. Now it's a preference, like an annoyance.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
A preference.
An annoyance is a preference.
My preference is to not hang around that person because they're just not fun to be with. Versus,
I don't enjoy it. Yep.
Oh my God, I can't be in the same room. If I was in the same room with them, I'd have to crawl through the window to get out.
Exactly, because I'm so hurt and so unsafe and I'm so not okay.
Yeah.
Versus I just don't prefer to be with them. If somebody's cussing me out, if I'm okay, it's not hurting me, but I don't prefer to be around someone that's cussing me out.
You know, a few months back, I shared this with a person I was talking to that was going through some marital issues. And I just said to him, I said, hey, I understand he has a lot of shame because he had done something that was hurtful. Yeah. But I said, that pain that you're dealing with in your spouse was there before you.
Yeah. And that's what gets difficult because
you might be an abrasiveness to it.
Yes,
and you're rubbing up against
spouses are pressing against that pain for sure, which is an amazing opportunity for the pain to come up, to be taken care of. But that's where it gets tricky because our justifiable blamer says, well, if you did this big bad thing in our marriage, all this pain I'm feeling originated with you. And until you fix it, I'm not going to be okay. But when I recognize, even if it's a really big, bad action, I can still be okay if the pain that pressed on. And how I know that's so true is, let's say, for example, in a marriage, someone like had an affair. Two different people are going to respond so differently based on their pain. And when I've seen that play out like that, I'm like, oh, I think in my logical, justifiable blame that every single person, if you had an affair, would be so hurt and so upset. An affair is what hurt me, and an affair is what ruined everything. But then I'll see a person side by side and they're affected by it. They're lowercase h hurt by the affair, but they're okay. They're at peace. They're healing. They're working through it because they don't have that same wound that caused me to interpret that affair as the source of all of my pain and all of my problem. So this isn't it's not meant to be a heartless, no one can hurt you or help you. It's not meant to be like that. It's actually meant to be empowering, to say the things that you feel are so hurtful towards you. If you properly care for yourself and you walk through the compassion method, you can be okay even when really bad things happen, and have the compassion and the grief to be able to say, this is really sad and this is really hard, but I'm okay.
Well, it gives you an understanding of, and sometimes you're like, you should be more upset. There's got to be something wrong with you that you're not more upset.
I have totally thought that. I'm like, oh, it's just because there's something wrong with them. But when you see the fruit of true peace and true joy and true okay, which my definition of okay is clear-minded, tenderhearted, at peace, that shows us that you're not shut down. You're actually really feeling, but you're just not in those capital letter emotions because you're in your adult self, not your child self.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Which is good to know because, a lot of us have a high value for forgiveness. And if we don't get out of that blame place,
yep.
Not only are we not going to bring healing to our inner world, is we're not going to be able to forgive.
And that's where people usually camp out. You're the source of my pain. You hurt me. And that's why, like, if someone never says sorry, people usually stay in unforgiveness your whole life because you believe that your healing, you're okay, is contingent on what that person does or doesn't do. And you could be waiting your whole life.
In these most extreme versions where we've seen this in society, you see it in like the death penalty.
Yeah.
And like somehow, that's the ultimate punishment for the crime. And somehow that's going to bring that justice is going to actually help your inner world.
Big response to a big wrongdoing, but it actually doesn't satisfy it.
No, nothing will. No. Nothing apart from bringing comfort to your inner world.
Exactly.
And the compassion method is one method to do that. So.
Exactly. And when we are able to effectively apply that to our hearts, you'll recognize that you'll be in those lowercase letter feelings more and more. And the power for another person to hurt you or the desperate need for someone to help you will diminish. And now we can lowercase h need people to help us and lowercase h experience hurt.
Good. Well, I hope everybody was able to comfort their trigger as Laura shared through this last quote.
Nobody could hurt you. Yeah.
And you understand the heart before. And I think it's great because it's kind of like, a lot of authors and Jesus himself used hyperbole a lot, and it gets people's attention and it forces you to think. So
it really does. And at first it's a hard concept to explore, but the more you explore it, you'll be able to see it's true for your life as well.
So kind of to conclude our time today, I wrote out a little conclusion that I'd like to work through. But as these quotes illustrate, the compassion method will challenge your thinking in many ways, as we just had that happen. Many of us have tried to use logic to bring comfort to our inner world. And for me in my life, that was reading books, spiritual studies, whatever I could do to access more logic. But for the compassion method to help you and for these quotes to make sense, you will need to combine your logic. We don't want to get rid of it. Logic is very important, with learning how to feel. And when you do this, these quotes will make all the sense in the world.
Exactly. Understand them and feel them.
Feel them. Yes. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the second edition of Famous Quotes with Laura Duncan. And please join us next time as we answer some of your questions.
Sounds great. Everybody have a great day or night.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye. So thank you for joining us for this episode of Triggered and True. If you'd like to learn more about Laura and the compassion method, we encourage you to follow Laura on Instagram or Facebook. And also, Laura has created a great resource that she calls the Compassion Method Master Course. And that can be found at compassionmethod.net. Thank you again for joining us. And until next time, goodbye.